Yeah, good morning. It's or maybe it's afternoon when you're taking the time to look at this. It is sometime on Monday morning when I am recording this quick video announcement for the week on Tuesday. We're into week 3 of the course. Congratulations. You've gotten most of the sort of preliminary background reading out of the way. I start the course off with this sort of brief examination of Native identity, both in popular culture and in tribal communities, where people have written in the last few years, both historical autobiographical, with David Troyer, and then also the autobiography as fiction that was put out by Asa Carter. And hopefully you read the stuff in the order that I asked you to, because I think it's important for us to get that reaction that we get from reading Carter. If once you read Carter, whether you liked Carter or not, whether you thought that his deeply romanticized and sort of tragic story of Cherokeeness, of Little Tree, the character, was in any way accurate, if you felt some sense of empathy or felt that sentimental tug on your heartstrings to sort of get you to that place. And then you find out that it's written by, the same guy who wrote Segregation Now, Segregation Today, Segregation Tomorrow, Segregation Forever, Wallace's famous speech on the steps of the Capitol in Alabama. That this guy is this, insane, tried to juxtapose those two people up beside each other and realized that you were probably whether or not you enjoyed the reading or not, I think it changes your reading in some ways. So I think this idea that someone had sort of made a claim to nativeness that was later found out to probably be, for all intents and purposes, a false claim. And that doesn't really deny anyone the right to sort of self-identify as native, if that's what they might choose to do. But then to sort of write an autobiography and sell their story as that, and to use these images and representations of nativeness, and specifically Cherokeeness, to sort of make your case and make it believable, only to find out that you've duped your readership in a way. And it duped not only non-native readers, but also native readers as well, and native critics as well. So I think it's a really interesting test case, in that the only truth probably, the only truth in a book like Forrest Carter's, which in the end is purely a work of fiction, the only truth in that book is in its ability to sort of tell the lie. And I'll write a quick post about this from a guy named Thomas King, who wrote a piece called Too Heavy to Lift, where he talks about dead Indians. And he talks about this idea, this invention of Indianness, beads and buckskin and behaving in a certain way and talking in a certain way. In many ways, that's an act of nativeness. And for King anyway, it's an act of it's a dead act. It's an act that doesn't necessarily have a place in time. I'll post that article for you and the announcement for today. You don't need to read it. It's a really short, funny piece. I'll probably include it in next year's readings. I just, there's a lot of stuff we have to read, and I can't ask you guys to read it all. So I tend not to do that. I've been reading some of your discussions, and I think you guys make really strong posts. I think, by the time I'm making this announcement, I think 17 or 18 of you, there's 30 of you in the class this semester, or 31. I overloaded the course quite a bit. I think you guys, if you take the time to think about what it is you want to write, I'm really impressed with some of the ideas that you guys are putting forth. I think if you're looking for some really interesting posts for this week, I think you could probably look at your classmates. Emily Leach's, I think, is good. Peyton Zacks, I think, also has some interesting questions. And what I wanted to come back with this idea of, and I'll see maybe people will respond to it sometime here today or maybe not. And if you didn't, you should maybe go back and look at Emily's post where she asked the question, how does one identify a sort of, I can look at it real quick. Let me look. I think the question is basically, how does one authentically identify their whiteness? And it's a fabulous question. I guess my answer is that they don't, right? You don't have to sort of identify whiteness. It's not expected. in a way that it's expected of of other sort of ethnic groups. And I think that that stems back to the fact that whiteness stands into that thing as that thing which just sort of is. And while certain ethnic groups in the United States, I'm thinking of the Italian and the Irish, I guess specifically, had to sort of earn their whiteness. And maybe we'll throw the Cubans in there too, just to take a shot at the Cubans. They sort of earn their whiteness over time, so eventually, it becomes, and I guess as a diasporic people, maybe Judaic or Jews have as well, right? They've sort of earned this sort of place to a certain degree, right? To where it's not expected. People simply don't expect people to sort of identify in this certain way, because it's seen as the reality, right? We sort of accept this idea of whiteness as sort of the reality in some sense, when in fact it's not. When in fact that in of itself is sort of a social construction. In a way that other groups don't have to. Other people have asked about the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. I posted on that. I also posted on the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, when people were sort of, I forget the student it was, but asked about how Natives sort of define or identify themselves through spirituality in some sense. And I think that Native communities do, but I can tell you this, Native belief systems and Native spirituality is something that's kept pretty close within communities, and it's not something that's readily shared very often. Now, I know you can probably find a number of people who would, I say that, but you would probably find a number of people who may conduct sweats as, sweat lodge or something like that as a means of recovery circles and stuff. You may even find people willing to charge you money in order to sort of take part in religious spiritual practices. But much of that stuff, I think, has been divorced in some ways from its sort of foundations. And so I would think that most foundational Native religious places are kept pretty close to the community, I think. And especially like Meday societies in the Native American Church. I'm thinking here within Wisconsin, Native American Church is pretty big amongst Ho-Chunks. Meday Society is pretty big amongst Ojibways, and it's not something you just sort of come walking into off the street. It's certainly something that's kept very close and meaningful to the community, and it's not like something where one proselytizes and sort of brings in converts, into the community. But at the same time, Native religions were outlawed until 1978, and Native religious practices were outlawed until 1978. So you can take a look at those posts. Beginning this week, we will be reading Charles Eastman's From the Deep Woods to Civilization. You'll also need to be reading Good Indian, Charles Eastman as a Warrior Servant by Lopenzina. So you'll have a secondary article to read. You'll also have about 75 pages of Eastman. The Eastman reading is a pretty quick reading. You'll also have a really brief video to sort of watch. And then we'll begin. We're going to be talking about concepts of like assimilation, acculturation, and transculturation in Charles Eastman. Eastman's an interesting figure. He's one of the first wave of Native intellectuals to come out of the middle of the 19th century and into the 20th century, meaning that he studied he was there. His view of the reservation is unique because he did not grow up on a reservation. He grew up actually still living I guess we'll call it traditional lifestyle of the Dakota in the mid 19th century. His father eventually homesteads and founds a colony of Santee in the Dakota Territories. But he never really resides on a reservation until much later in his life when he goes to work on one. And so his view of the reservation space is radically different, I think, than sort of the views of the reservation space that we saw. I start us out in the very contemporary part of the 20th century, and then I'll take us back into the 19th century. So I really want us to maybe begin to compare spaces and how people sort of operate within those spaces, and how Native identity sort of operates within these spaces, and how maybe it might transgress spaces that are sort of prescribed by law and proscribed by law and cultural practices in the 19th and 20th centuries. I hope you're having fun with the course. Any questions, as always, check in with me. I'm always available. I'll keep sort of checking in on the discussion boards, and you'll get most of your comments from me as I read your discussions in your journals and through these Tuesday announcements. But if you ever need me for anything else, let me know. I'm hoping that through the text and through the readings that I give us, you'll be able to we'll develop